Well, let's jump into his biography. Klemens von Metternich was born in May 1773 in Koblenz in modern-day Germany. What do we know of his childhood? Was it an aristocratic upbringing, Arthur?
We know that, so he's from the old aristocracy of Austria. He was born in the kind of small state of Germany. At that time, it was what we call the Saint-Empire Romain Germanique. What is the...
Holy Roman Empire.
Holy Roman Empire,
yeah.
Exactly. So it was a kind of federation between small states, okay? And basically, we can say that Austria was the most powerful of this big alliance, okay? So it was a federation, but with the kind of superpower of Austria. And he was member of that whole aristocracy. His father was comment tu dis, un haut fonctionnaire.
He was a high dignitary.
Yeah, high dignitary
minister
of the empire. So he's definitely a man of the hand of the 18th century. He believed in the old regime. He grew up in the old regime. He believed in the Catholic Empire. He believed in religion. So his mindset is completely focused on the old regime. That's what I can say.
And born in Germany, he was not Austrian at all. And in fact, he studied in Strasbourg and Mainz, two of the best universities of the time, and especially Strasbourg under strong French influence. For his entire life, he would speak better French than German.
Yeah. In 1788, he began studying law at Strasbourg, where he's described as some as happy and handsome, and by others as a liar and a braggart. Do you think he had two sides of his personality? I know, a really good diplomat kind of has like one side, a good side and a bad side. They know when to show it. Do you think he was an honest person or a schemer, or what is your opinion? I don't think he was as bad as Talleyrand, but do you think he was always had a hidden agenda when he was talking to people?
I don't, actually. I think he was incredibly consistent. And in fact, he seems, as Arthur was saying, this is the stereotypical, prototypical aristocrat. I mean, everything in his history and his family and his being was sort of built perfectly to oppose the revolution, right? So his father's a high dignitary. He comes from and serves the Austrian monarchy, which is the legendary enemy of nationalism. During the War of the First Coalition, some of his familiar lands are swept away. So he doesn't have that sort of youthful enthusiasm for reform, for liberalism, for nationalism that a lot of his contemporaries did. In fact, he had a tutor, a gentleman named Simon, who had a great influence on him. But as soon as the French Revolution happened, Simon became a very serious and very active revolutionary. And Metternich, despite being very young, immediately saw the error of his tutor's ways and immediately saw that this was a mistaken radicalism. He did not fall at all for the revolution or its many passions. So he was sort of born conservative, and he maintained that throughout his life. So of course he put on many different faces and portraits throughout his career. But what you find, I think, if you study it a bit closely, is that he was remarkably consistent. He was an incredibly consistent status quo man, a conservative and an aristocrat who fought pretty much for the same thing in 1809 as he did in 1848.
Yeah, actually, you have to keep in mind that the French Revolution was understandable only by French people. I mean, in Europe, the French Revolution was quite a good news for labor people, for the very poor people, because it was a message of liberation, of, what carry a revolution in history anytime. So for labor people, it was quite a good news and a kind of hope, maybe. But for the high society, it was just a small event, a chaos, and it was not possible to imagine a new way to rule the world without king, without emperor. So you have to be French to understand the French Revolution in 1789. So on that part, is not so special, is not so specific. I mean, everybody in the old regime, in the high society of European country, England, Prussia, Austria, everybody is against the French Revolution. Because for
Right.
that kind of people, Europe at that time was just a one country, actually. There is no frontier. Of course, there is some war, but it's like war with courtesy, you know? When you start war, it's
Right.
okay. Of course, you don't invade country, you don't occupy city, you know?
Right.
It's courtesy. So now it's chaos. So nobody understands that. So of course he does not.
Yeah, I should probably add that's such a good point. You know, he himself referred to himself so many times as a European, as a cosmopolitan. You know, multiple times saying that what he wanted to build and what the Congress system eventually became was something very similar to the European Union. It's interesting to look at Metternich's reaction because he was aware of the Glorious Revolution in England. He was aware of the American Revolution, and he didn't sort of show as much hatred and disdain for those two revolutions as he did for the French Revolution. And the reason for that, he said, is that the Glorious Revolution and the American Revolution were political revolutions. What he hated about the French Revolution was the social aspect, the idea that you topple the king and that the masses now certainly rule the country. And that is what he despised and feared most of all.
Yeah, by the way, Austria and French share something in common. You know, the Habsburg and the Capet, the Bourbon, but actually the Bourbon are the Capet. They are the two oldest dynasty in Europe. So for a guy from Austria to kill a man from that kind of dynasty, it's completely crazy. I mean, it's not understandable.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the aristocratic opinions of some of these revolutions, like Lafayette. You know, he obviously came over to America to help us with our revolution, while France was going through their revolution. So, just interesting to see the aristocratic response. Some supported, like you said, and some like fled the country or were executed during the revolution. So it's a very complicated time. Getting back to Metternich, though, he works for his father during this time. His father's been appointed chief minister of the Austrian Netherlands. So I think he's studying law, but he's also working for his dad in a foreign country, which, the Netherlands was. He wasn't born there. Probably a good learning experience for him, no?
Absolutely. This time of his life is absolutely foundational. And I would say for three reasons. One, you're right, he works under his father, very recognized and powerful diplomat within the Habsburg court, so it gives him all sorts of experience and access, but also because during these first years, and especially during the War of the First Coalition, Metternich meets two groups of people. First, he meets the revolutionaries and the Jacobins. At some point, he even leads interrogations of representatives from the national conventions. So he gets to know these people, he hears what their arguments are, he hears their grand sweeping vision and revolutionary rhetoric. But he also meets the émigrés, the stranded aristocrats from France that were in the Austrian Netherlands, at least some of them, planning to reconquer the country. He meets these two groups of people, and it's very interesting. His biographer, Wolfram Seaman, studied his papers, Metternich's private papers, the notes he did, and the private newspaper clippings that he himself highlighted. And he considers both these groups of people as radical. He, of course, is fundamentally an opponent of the revolution and their representatives. He's also, he also writes himself that the émigrés are radicals, and that the reason that this revolution happened is because they misgoverned France. So these first few years, when he's under his father working as his secretary, it's his first taste of diplomacy, it's his first taste of politics, his first taste of war, because he sees the opening hostilities of the wars of the First Coalition, and he also gets to meet these two fundamental groups of people, these two fundamental players, the Jacobins, which he interrogates himself, despite being very young, and the émigrés. So it's really the start of his life and his career, and much of what he would later achieve is traceable to that time.
Yeah, and I think you have to understand one thing more about him is that Metternich is not against modernity. I mean, he is aware that the world is changing. I mean, he knows that because everybody knows it in Europe. He knows that everything is changing at that time, for sure. And what we have to keep in mind to understand France at the end of the 18th century and the French Revolution is that immigrants they were against modernity. I mean, they thought that nothing was made to be changed. Or, obviously, time were changing. That was obvious. And Metternich was for peace, he was for the emperor, he was for the, but not against modernity. And you have to have in mind that the old aristocracy, we had the power in France, was completely against change, which was not exactly the case of Austria, because contrary to what we can think, Austria was quite modern, actually, and the administration was quite modern. So he was not, he was quite moderate in this game.
That's such a oh, go ahead, Jean.
Point, like when change comes up, you can either be afraid of it or you can embrace it and say, all right, well, how are we going to make this go with this change and make things more modern? So, Arthur, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
It's such a fundamental point that Arthur brought up, and it's part of the reason why I didn't want to call him a reactionary. Metternich saw the émigrés who wanted to change nothing, who thought you could just reinstitute the Ancien Régime, and he thought these people were crazy, that you had to make some changes and some reforms. But he didn't think you did it by sweeping visions and by overturning everything overnight. It's sort of the noblesse obligée for Metternich. It's slow reforms over time, and it's royal reform. I mean, it comes from the top down and not from the bottom up. So, for example, after the Napoleonic Wars, one of the things that he wanted to institute in Austria was to give the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Italians some form of autonomy in the Austrian Empire. He wanted to give them parliaments so that he would sort of inoculate Austria against further revolution. And that's really the Metternich ethos. Slow, steady, peaceful reform over decades by the emperor so that you don't get sort of social and political revolutions. Of course, that didn't happen because the emperor was much more sort of ancien régime than he was, but that certainly speaks at least to his vision for how you keep the lid on revolutions.
Yes, following the American historian Martin Malia, we can say that Metternich was in favor of a conservative revolution.
Yes.
So you have to change, but don't change the top. And the bottom is not made to rule.
Yeah.
Yeah. In 1794, he undertakes his first diplomatic mission to England, where he promotes arming the German people. He has to return to Vienna after his father has been chased out of the Netherlands by the invading French armies. I know he worked with Emperor Francis, who, although he's not the brightest guy, I don't think Emperor Francis, he was a survivor and, he was king of Austria. What do you think of Francis here? Was he, like you said, he's ancient regime. Do you think he was a bright man, or what's your opinion on Metternich's soon-to-be boss?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, Emperor Francis of Austria, what was your opinion on him?
Que je comprends bien la question. Du coup, c'est, oui.
Ton opinion sur l'empereur Francis.
Ah oui, d'accord, ok. One very funny story about Francis to understand him is that when he became Emperor of Austria, he decided to wear a military uniform, which was not the case of the two last Austrian emperor. So it's a big change. It means that Francis believed in army, and he wanted to, how can I say that? He wanted to put Austria at the top of the military competition in Europe. Because he had in mind the last war in Europe, that Austria indeed won. But there is a kind of discrepancy between the idea he had on Austria and what Austria was indeed. I mean, Austria was a very old country and a very old army, and so he made a lot of decisions in consideration of the idea he has on his country, which was not the reality. And he decided to have around him, beyond the whole aristocracy, like very old guy, very old-fashioned guy,
Right.
He believed in the old family, so he was not exactly a modern guy. He was not, definitely not. And he had a fight with all his brothers, because the Austrian royal family is a mess, to be honest. Everybody wants to take the power of the other one, blah, blah, blah. So he lives in another world, if I may say. He's not stupid at all, but he lives in another world, and he wants to put back Austria. He wants to put Austria back, actually.
Back on top. Yeah. No, I understand that.
But he's also, he was a very silent guy, for example. He didn't talk to anyone. He refused to have conversation with his aristocracy because he considered himself as a kind of god. So he doesn't want to justify any political decision or blah, blah, blah. And very surprising thing, when Napoleon was in Vienna, in Schönbrunn, in the castle, the palace of of Francis, when he was in Vienna, he met the Austrian aristocracy during several hours. And at the end of that meeting, the guy of the aristocracy was like, wow, he beat us and he was talking to us during many hours. Our emperor lost 2 main battles and he's still silent. He refused to talk with anyone and he refused to justify anything. So there is a big opposition between 2 models of emperor, if I may say.
Right. Yeah, I always found it fascinating, Francis, because Napoleon beat his armies in Italy in 1796, 1797, again in 1800 at Marengo, again in 1805 at Austerlitz, again in 1809 at Wagram. And like his brothers, like Archduke Charles and John, say, we need to reform the armies. We can't be going to war, and he would just ignore them and go to war with Napoleon over and over again. It was, that's a good point, Arthur. I don't know if he really understood the counsel or advice he was receiving. And like you said, he wasn't talking to any of these people on a regular basis. He was just like, let's go to war. I want Austria to be back on top.
And despite what many people have said about Metternich, specifically before the 1808-1809 war, which ultimately led to Wagram, and this is something that Seaman, Metternich's biographer, makes perfectly clear, Metternich was against renewed hostilities with France at that time. It's true that the Austrian army had been reformed. It's true that it was placed under some of its most capable commanders, and it was a formidable force. But Metternich was convinced that Austria should never go to war with France alone. He did everything he could to strengthen relations with Russia. He also was convinced that the peace treaty at Tilsit would never last, and the Tilsit world order would never last, or with Prussia. He did not want for Austria to go to war alone against France. But at the same time, he highlighted so many times in his diplomatic notes and his memoranda that the French were suffering in Spain. And so he is sort of an ambivalent figure. He tells his emperor, don't go to war alone. But at the same time, he tells him over and over again, France is weakened, France is weakened, France is weakened. So he bears some responsibility for the disastrous 1808-1809 war.
Okay, we're coming up to that. I just want to. Sorry, I just want to.
No, it's okay.
So in 1801, he's appointed Austrian minister in Saxony. A few years later, he's serving in a similar role in Prussia, and he fails to persuade King Frederick William to join the Russians and the Austrians in the 1805 war against Napoleon. The year after that, 1806, he's made Austrian minister to France, and he wisely becomes friends with Talleyrand and begins to learn the ways of Napoleon's mind and character. Do you think Napoleon liked Metternich? Did they? I know they had a relationship. Could you explain their relationship?
Actually, Metternich was quite impressed by Napoleon because he saw everything on Napoleon. I mean, he was impressed by his energy. He was impressed by his way of managing people. He saw that all the energy he put into the administration, for the reform, blah, blah, blah. So actually, he understood a little bit more the French Revolution when he was in Paris, because he saw the guy who was carried by the revolution somehow, because Napoleon is a guy from revolution. He's a son of revolution, and he knows that. So to him, when he met Napoleon, revolution was not only a chaos. The revolution had a sense with Napoleon. So he get that. He met all the Napoleon family, because you have to know that, of course, the Bonaparte in Paris are like so famous people. I mean, there is party everywhere. There is a lot of money.
Sure.
he met his sister Caroline, one of Napoleon's sister. He had a relationship with her, so he was quite close to the center of the power. Actually, he met Talleyrand. I mean, Metternich was a very famous protagonist of Paris life, if I may say, and he was quite happy there, and people like him. So Metternich really liked Napoleon, even if he saw the limits of Napoleon, because he saw also that Napoleon was a military and only a military, and he believed in powerful, in battle, in victory, in strongness. But he knows that it was not enough to create something we can survive to the century, you know.
Yeah. And if I may, on the flip side of that, Napoleon was kind of impressed with Metternich, and it takes a while for him to admit it. But this goes back to something that's deeply psychological about Napoleon. One of the main objectives of Napoleon was asserting his legitimacy. He said over and over again that the kings of France and the Habsburgs have 1,000 years in rule. That's their legitimacy. He didn't. He just arrived. He comes from a relatively poor, low nobility in a backwater called Corsica. And so he had this psychological complex. Some may say this is the true Napoleonic complex, to come from an upstart family that nobody knew. He saw Metternich as the opposite, this grand, elegant aristocrat who comes from a legendary family, not the highest of Austrian nobility, but a very renowned family. And he saw him and was kind of fascinated by him. And we see this in many aspects of his life. And of course, he respected his adversity. And at the end of his life on St. Helena, he says that Metternich was the only statesman he really ever met of the period. So there's mutual fascination between the two enemies. I should also say that at the end of about 1813, we'll get to that point, but then the relationship changes completely, and Metternich completely guesses that Napoleon has lost grips on reality.
And by the way, both of them are great seducers, because Napoleon, of course, was a general, was whatever you want, but he was a great seducer, of course.
Yeah, charisma. Yeah, he was. And I often, obviously Napoleon was a great general, but there's a difference between being a great general and a great politician. The Duke of Wellington, great general, was a terrible prime minister. U.S. Grant, general of the U.S. Army, a terrible president.
No, he was a great president. Don't say that. Grant was a great president. Grant was a fantastic president. This is his black legend. He created the justice system, annihilated the Ku Klux Klan. He had many important reforms. He was a fantastic president.
maybe his appointees were bad then. Maybe that's what it was. But,
black legend.
It is two distinct things, though, to be a good politician and a good general. And I think Metternich was a fantastic politician. Going back to our point on 1809, he makes a misstep in thinking Napoleon's army was weakened due to the Peninsular War and advocates going to war again with Napoleon. And although it's closer than the previous wars, Austria loses yet again. But you guys talked about earlier, this wasn't just Metternich's fault. Like, Emperor Francis wanted to go to war. And then for a long time after that, Austria sits out the wars. They help in Russia, guarding a flank. Even the 1813 campaign in Germany, they kind of sit out. And Metternich's they're like a neutral party, right?
Yeah, so just real quickly, this is a debated point. It's not at all sure one way or the other, but as Seaman makes clear, Metternich sends a couple memoranda right before the declaration of war in 1808 to his emperor. One of them is, yes, France is weakened by Spain, etc., but the other is stressing how important it is for Austria not to join the war alone. And it's not at all sure that Metternich was on the war side of this conversation. It's true the Austrian army had been reformed. It's true many of the top leaders thought this was a good time to recapture lost provinces. The Austrian economy was suffering. They were undergoing a lot of deficit. And they thought now's the good time. He's suffering in Spain. Let's strike now. I don't think Metternich was among those clamoring for war. He very, very much thought that the Russians had to be there. And of course, as Wagram was to show, he was right. The Russians should have been seduced to break their alliance with France earlier, or at least Prussia should have been held on. But right after the defeat of Wagram, that's when you can place full responsibility on Metternich. That's when he's foreign minister, and that's the start of the Metternich system, at least when it comes to Austrian foreign relations. So before that, ascribing blame to Metternich for the 1808-1809 war, I think is not wrong, but it's on tenuous ground. I think new information now shows that it wasn't really his say.
All right, Arthur, I'm going to ask you this next question. After peace with Austria, Napoleon divorces his wife Josephine and gets married to Mary Louise, the daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis. How involved was Metternich with this? Was this Napoleon's idea? Because I know he originally wanted to marry a Russian princess. Do you know how involved Metternich was in this?
Okay, so Louis told it a few minutes ago. Napoleon is fascinating by the old monarchies in Europe, but in that fascination, the country he admires is Russia, not Austria. To Napoleon, Russia is everything. And during the first 10 years of the war of Napoleon is convinced that peace is possible when we have a deal with Russia. But when Russia is not in the deal, there is no peace. There is no new world. And he's convinced that the new world can be settled between Russia and France. Okay, so Austria, Prussia, England, it's side part of the big deal to him. So first, he wants to marry one of Tsar's sister. That is first idea. So of course, he did not ask properly in a letter, my dear brother Alexander, blah blah blah. But he asked to some diplomats to feel, is it possible? And from Alexander the Tsar, it's no way. Absolutely impossible. So he knows that. And Talleyrand and Metternich had an idea. It was to make this alliance between France and Austria with the daughter of Francis, Marie-Louise. So it's an idea of Metternich, it's an idea of Talleyrand, and at the beginning, Napoleon doesn't want to, for a very fun reason, because he thinks she's not pretty and she's not fine. At that time, you can see the face of people on mug or painting, but you can't imagine really what they are. So he's not so fond of this idea. But it's a Metternich-Talleyrand deal, and finally, Metternich thinks it's a good idea because it's a way to save time for Austria, because he thinks that it's not possible anymore to fight France with army. So let's save time, and this wedding is perfect to save time. But in his mind, it's not. How can I say that? It's temporary. It's not a close deal.
Yeah. Well, she does provide him with a son, so she that part works.
Of course. And finally, Marie-Louise and Napoleon had quite a good relationship, and we can say that they fell in love.
Yeah, this was the great secondary consideration. He needed a son, but Arthur is so right about Metternich's his idea here. Why does Metternich want to marry the daughter of his emperor to the arch enemy of his state? And that's exactly because he knows that militarily we can no longer oppose France, so we must buy time. We must rearm, and if possible, and this is one of his genius maneuvers, we want to rearm with French approval. And this is why, psychology is so important. He understood Napoleon's psychology, Corsican mentality about the family. Napoleon could never imagine, as a Corsican with their strong family ethos, could never imagine that the father of his wife would declare war on him. It was impossible to him, especially after he had a son. He says many times, how could my stepfather declare war on his grandson, eventually, because the grandson's going to rule. So to him, it was impossible. And Metternich knew that. Metternich knows if we make a family pact, then we have Napoleon in the pocket. And what you see in 1810, 1811, 1812, 1813, you see Austria rearming with French approval. This is absolutely crazy. The arch enemy, who was defeated 4 times in 10 or 15 years, is rearming, and Napoleon wants them to rearm just because Metternich had so grasped the psychological implication for the Corsican of a family pact. And eventually, it also pushes Napoleon to accept Austrian mediation between the Allies and France.
That's a brilliant point. I never really thought about that. Like, did Metternich have this in mind the whole time? Like,
yes.
We'll just marry her off. In the meantime, we'll secretly rearm. Well, not so secretly rearm. And then we'll be neutral during, 1812. Well, 1812, they did send troops to Russia.
But under their own command, not under French command. And the Austrian corps does almost absolutely, I mean, so stop me if I'm wrong, Arthur, but it is completely sideshow in the Russian campaign. Yeah. They do almost nothing. They do, and that was willing. I mean, Metternich knew that we needed to keep the Austrian army intact in case our opportunity arose in a couple months or years, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Yes. It's true that it's very interesting about Napoleon, the way he used his family, because if you look at the Ancien Regime and the wedding between the different son and daughter of the different king, it's very useful and very usual for king to give the daughter or the son to the cousin who rule on England or blah blah blah. But Napoleon did not understand that was only politic.
Right.
It was only politic. It was not true. And to him, family is true.
I know, but it's funny.
But it's true. It's true. But it's not.
He should have known better. Like, his brothers and sisters let him down so many times. And Carolyn and Marshal Murat turned against him at the end. So he should have known, like, family doesn't mean they're not going to turn against you.
Yeah, but then you would have to take Napoleon out of his Corsican context, which is impossible. I mean, he was a man of Corsica. He was raised there. And listen, everything he does, and this is something Thierry Lenz, another legendary French historian and director of the Fondation Napoléon, has said so many times, people at that time spoke of the Bonaparte clan, because everything Napoleon did was promote his family. He puts them in crowns and kingdoms all over Europe. He marries them off. He grants them great responsibilities. He saw himself as the head of the clan, and he wanted to protect his family. And that eventually was a big part of his downfall. Yeah, they certainly didn't pay him back too much.
Okay. Well, he obviously loses in Russia and is greatly weakened. And in 1813, he's fighting in Germany to keep his empire. And I know Louis and Arthur, you wanted to discuss the highly theatrical meeting between Metternich and Napoleon in Dresden in June. What happened here? What were the aims of both men, and what was the outcome?
Actually, at the end of the Russian campaign, everybody thinks that Napoleon is over. Okay, and by the way, Austria thinks Napoleon is not able to build again a new army. But he did. He did for real. And he attacked again in 1813 on the east, so by the
Lutzen and Bautzen. Yeah.
Yes. And against all expectations, he won. He won 2 battles. And I believe they are not major battles, but they are significant battles. And there's a kind of panic in Prague, where the Austrian Empire and Austrian government is. They are like, whoa, he was not supposed to win this battle. In the same time, the small states of Germany, who were allied of Napoleon, was about to leave Napoleon to come back with Austria after the Russian campaign, the campaign of Russia. But when they saw the first victory of Napoleon, they finally decide to stand by, to wait. So they say to Austrian Empire, well, we don't know. Maybe we stay with the crazy one, because he's still winning. And Metternich himself is quite impressed, and he doesn't feel good in front of this victory. So he tried to negotiate with Napoleon, even if he's convinced that Napoleon is not able to negotiate because he does not believe in negotiation. He believes in power. That's all.
Right.
But he wants to try. So Caulaincourt, who was a very close diplomat around Napoleon, and Metternich decided to settle a meeting in Dresden, where Napoleon was. And during this day, because it's a one-day conversation, a legendary day actually, they had the conversation each other, and you have a crazy Napoleon saying to Metternich, I don't believe in you, I don't believe in diplomacy, and I know what you try to do. You try to do not respect what you have to do because you are my ally, and I am married with the daughter of your emperor, and blah, 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 what we say. And Metternich are like, okay, look at what is it. You cannot win that war. You can win battles, you cannot win the war. So we have two choices. We find a deal here, okay, and you go back in France as the emperor of France, but with our friends, with the frontier of before the revolution, the French Revolution, and Austria is okay to make the deal with Russia and blah blah blah. And Napoleon is like, I don't want to, and for a very simple reason is that you attack France. Napoleon see himself as a defender, because it's quite true historically. So he see himself as a defender. It's like, we defend France during 20 years. We are in Austria because you attack us. So why? I have to say to the 1 million people dead for France that they are dead for nothing. So
No
it's
reason.
not possible to me. So no way. And we can have that conversation at the end of the war, because I will win. And that time, there will be no mercy for Austria. Okay?
Yeah.
So at the end, Metternich go back to his emperor, and he's convinced that Napoleon is over. But there is a big debate between the historians, is that is the offer of Metternich was honest? Did he really believe? Was it really okay to give to Napoleon his throne and to let the France in peace in the new frontier, or was it just a game?
I've read that. I've read that Metternich said, you have old men and boys in your army, you're on your last leg. And Napoleon was defiant. He's like, I don't care. I'm going to beat you. It doesn't matter. Like, what kind of soldiers I have in my army. I think he thought, my intellect will beat you. But that wasn't the case. And then Leipzig happens, I think, in October 1813.
Sorry, John, but between Leipzig and Dresden, there is a very big moment, which is the Congrès de Prague.
Yeah.
Which is a very important meeting, because the Dresden meeting is a kind of before meeting of the Congrès de Prague, actually. And the game is still on at the Congrès de Prague, because Austria still say we are okay. So you have Russia, you have Prussia, you have Austria, you have France, you also have England. Because what we forgot is that at that time Austria decided to put England on the side, because they understood that England was putting a mess in the European business, because they are like, Metternich was convinced that England was putting a mess in European business. He's like, okay, they are very far away. They just want to put Napoleon away, but this is not the problem. The problem is, we can put the peace on Europe. So in Prague, the Europe is between Europe, and we try to find a good deal for all European countries. And in that idea, England is not part of Europe for Austrian people. So it's quite a good move from Austria, because it's quite honest, sincere. It's like, okay, we are between all nations. We don't want to hear about the craziness of England. So personally, I think that the offer was sincere. They really want to find a solution. Plus, Metternich had an idea. He saw that if Napoleon was not able to rule anymore, the daughter of the Emperor Francis was able to become an alternative in France. with the son of Napoleon. So Austria will be the big winner of the deal because there is peace, there is no more Napoleon, and there is a small piece of Austria in France.
And this is so true, and I happen to think Arthur is right and that the offer was honest also for another reason. Metternich, after Russia, is pretty much convinced Napoleon is done. He knows you cannot maintain a European order based on force. And that's essentially Napoleonic Europe. It's just force. He knew also it was based on one man. He said if Napoleon disappeared, the whole order collapses. So what does Metternich think? He says, okay, it's only a matter of time that this guy is here. Now, his worry not only focuses on Napoleon, but also on Russia. He knew Metternich knew Russia had European ambitions, and he absolutely did not want to destroy France so much that it left Russia as the primary European power. You know, there's this great phrase by Henry Kissinger. We haven't talked about him much today, but he is was a great Metternich scholar. And he says Austria was the seismograph of Europe. Any trouble, any uprising, Austria was the first to suffer. Geographically, it's the weakest state. It's in the middle of all the great powers. It has no natural frontiers to defend. It has an antiquated monarchy, all these different nationalities held together by the crown. So Metternich knows this. He is intimately aware of Austria's weakness, and he knows it will not survive if France is so weak that Russia is now the predominant European power. So he knows when he goes to Frankfurt, when he goes to the Prague Congress, we must not make France so weak so that it's not a counterweight to Russia. So almost is such a clairvoyant guy. Napoleon was not even defeated. He still had an army, and he already thought about the next steps. He already thought about preserving French strength so that it would act as a counterweight to Russia.
And another thing very important is that in Metternich mind, he doesn't want to put an old king of France on the throne of France. He doesn't want the Bourbon back at all.
Right.
This is the idea of England, not his idea. He doesn't believe in that. That's why I said at the beginning of the conversation that he was not against modernity. He knew that the Bourbon was not in the 19th century. They were not the guy France needs.
Well, let me ask you guys, because I'm a big Napoleon fan. So, Lutzen and Bautzen, he has a ton of leverage. They offer him a peace treaty. He says no. Then Dresden, he wins that one. But then McDonald loses at Katzbach. Ney and Oudinot lose outside of Berlin, so he has less leverage. He says no to a peace. Leipzig happens, which is a huge loss. He says no to peace. France is invaded in 1814. He still says no to peace. Do you think he should have accepted one of these? Like, I know the Frankfurt proposals were to reduce France to their natural frontiers, but they lose control of Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, which, of course, Napoleon rejected. Do you think he should have accepted any one of these?
Well, this is one of the most fascinating questions of the Napoleonic story. And I think the whole question rests upon another question, which is, was Napoleon right about his legitimacy? Arthur was completely right. 1 million Frenchmen or so, a little less, had died in Germany and in Italy. Napoleonic legitimacy was built upon these conquests, right? That's why he was allowed. He was given the opportunity and the power to be raised to the purple and become emperor. It's because he was such a brilliant general. Napoleon was convinced, I give up Germany, I give up Italy, that's it. I cannot survive. He says to Metternich in in Dresden, he says, your Habsburg emperor could lose 3 wars, and he's fine because it's been here for 1,000 years. I have been here for 15. So I don't know if he was right. With the benefit of hindsight, of course he should have accepted the Frankfurt proposals. It would still have left France probably the dominant power in Europe, the natural borders. In the wonderful phrase of Talleyrand, France would stop being immense and would only be great. And I think that absolutely should have happened. But would he have survived Napoleon domestically? Would his followers and France as a whole tolerate this upstart who now had lost the only argument which put him on the throne in the first place? I don't know. But one thing about Napoleon, and this is something which is very important to note, and I'm sorry, John, I'm also a Napoleon fan, Arthur is, but one thing you have to say is that by 1813, clearly a big change has happened. He has lost grips on reality. He believes himself to be invincible. He also is a terrible strategist, long-term strategist. He's a terrible diplomat, if not at all a diplomat, and he thinks that you don't negotiate when you're on the way up. But that's exactly when you negotiate. You negotiate when you have leverage. He's like, no, there will be a final turnaround, and of course, to the great ruin of France, there is not. And this is really the dark time in the Napoleonic legacy, and he does immeasurable harm to France by refusing to negotiate when he still had some chips on his side.
Yeah, that's
What do you think,
true.
Arthur?
What we have to say, if we want to be honest about Napoleon, is that from 1811, he's completely crazy. And
Yes.
he refused to see the evidence
Yes.
of the fail. I mean, we know that now because the very, very good book had been published in recent years about that. We know that in 1811, he knows by all his administration that the empire is not working anymore. Not in France, not in the north of Italy. And why? In Austria. Austria is another world. So he refuses to see the reality, for sure. It begins in 1811, and of course, in 1813, it's worse. That is for sure. But in the same time, in Europe at that time, there is two different conversations, two different problems. There is England. There is the relationship between France and England, and there is the relationship between France and Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The problem is that Napoleon mixed all the conversation. And the fact is that he did not understand that he couldn't fight in the same time all the Europe and England. And even if sometimes Europe and England had different views and different views, he tried to keep these two sides, and it was a very big mistake because you cannot make peace in Europe if you don't have a deal with England and you don't have a fair deal with Austria, Russia, and Prussia, I mean the continent. So that was, to me, the big mistake of Napoleon. It was to fight England and to fight at the same time Europe. It was too much.
Right, and I think that's what happened. You know, obviously he has his downfall 1814. He comes back in 1815, but all of Europe is united against him. So really Waterloo, it really didn't matter. He was going to lose eventually when they're all united against him. Metternich is at the Congress of Vienna, which discusses, you know, how Europe is shaped after Napoleon. How do you think he did in the Congress of Vienna, and how did Austria do?
Well, I would say there's two great triumphs in his life. One is 1813, and it's the maneuvering, as we said, of Austria, a French ally, into mediation with Napoleonic approval. I mean, that is such a triumph of diplomacy. We can rearm. We're a military ally. We can rearm, and we become mediator between the Allies and Napoleon. He pulls that off. I mean, amazing how he does that. And two, it's the Congress of Vienna, and that's the real start of what we call the Metternich system. By the way, he hated the fact that you called it the Metternich system. That people still called it at that time. He thought it was a terrible idea to individualize this system. It was against everything he stood for. But nonetheless, we call it, I think with some truth, the Metternich system. And that is the great concert of Europe. It's the great cooperation. We agree on common enemies, nationalism, liberalism, and we agree on the cooperation of monarchs. And again, another triumph, something that the Europeans would fail to do 100 years later. We give France a seat at the table because he was terrified of Prussian influence in Germany and Russian influence in Europe. So France is absolutely, immediately we forget about the war for 20 years, which decimated European manhood and European economy, and we immediately give them a seat back at the table. And we use them to act as a counterweight to Prussia and Germany and to Russia more broadly. So this is really his triumph, I think.
Yeah, in the same time, we have to admit that the Congress of Vienna is in favor of Austrian reality. I mean, the fact is that France is, and still in 1815, is the first army of Europe. France is able to invade country. France is able to fight everybody at the same time. If you put the power with the army and with the military, France is first for sure. So of course you have to put a competing model in front of that, and saying that okay, Europe has to be in peace, blah blah blah. Okay, of course, has to be in peace, but with my rule, with my interest, and with the thing my country is still able to do. And Austria is not able to fight against anyone at that time in Europe. So, of course, it's peace, but it's peace in favor of the strong point of Austria.
Listen to Austria by 1815 is the weakest military state in Europe. And yet, it orchestrates not only the victory over Napoleon, but the peace and order that would last a century. That is all due to Metternich. He knows that military strength, if we rely on military strength, as Arthur was saying, Austria is doomed. So we rely on diplomacy and legitimacy. It's part of the reason why, if we go back to 1813 for a second, it was so important for Metternich, and this is something Kissinger talks about for dozens of pages. It was so important that Austria not just break the alliance with France and go to war. Because Austria, as a country, as a state, depended on the sanctity of treaties. If suddenly it said, we break our alliance with France and we go to war, it set a very dangerous precedent, because Austria, alone amongst the other major powers, depended on the sanctity of treaties and on something approximating international law. If a country could just throw away an alliance, Austria was doomed in the future. It was very important that Austria maneuver while respecting treatises and while maintaining legitimacy and stability.
Yeah, and we have a long period of peace here after 1815. Now, whether that was due to just exhaustion from the Napoleonic Wars or because of the Congress of Vienna, pretty much until 1848, there's no major wars in Europe. So something worked. People understood, like, we need to come up with a better system, and I think Metternich was a big part of that.
Hey, go ahead, Arthur.
No, I would say that, and if you look at Austria during the 19th century to the end of the First World War, you can notice that they were not able to win any war. They lost against Napoleon III at Solferino. I don't have to remind you what happened during the First World War. Austria was not exactly...
They get blown apart by the Austro-Prussian War.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Also,
yes.
So I mean, I think Metternich has quite a good idea with creating a country based on peace and power of peace.
Yep, I agree. Well, let's discuss his career after Napoleon, from 1815 onwards. How does he do in this time frame? I know it goes pretty well until about 1848.
Yeah, there's multiple crises that he deals with, whether it is, rising sedition and revolutionary spirit in the German states, whether it is the Greek crisis. But I mean, it's fascinating to look at these events individually, but I don't think I'm going too wrong when I say that he saw all of these crises as pretty much the same thing. For him, 1789, the French Revolution, is the big enemy, and it's the same thing in 1830. It's the same thing right before the Carlsbad measures. It's the same thing over and over again. All of these revolts is really the threat of social revolution. And this is when he earns the nickname, the coachman of Europe, the doctor of revolutions, because he always applies, and this is why it goes back to our early conversation when I said he was so consistent. It's always the conservative revolution, slow reform over decades, and never give in to the mobs, and never give in to the crowds, and never give in to the sweeping visions that say we're going to tear everything to shreds and redo a new society in 24 hours. It's always a very consistent model. He wants to govern, and he wants to convince the labor and the lower classes, you should be governed by us because we govern efficiently. It's a good model, as long as you govern efficiently. But when you stop governing efficiently, when you don't give bread, when you don't ensure stability and prosperity, well, then you get kicked in the teeth. And that's pretty much exactly what happens in 1848, following what we call the Hungry 40s, a decade of troubling socioeconomic situations. And he famously gets kicked out, although his system survives even 1848. All of the revolutions, almost all, with, of course, token reforms and very important reforms, the abolishing of serfdom in Austria, amongst others, but his system survives. He avoids a major war. The Franz Joseph gets on the throne, who's even more conservative than the uncle, and he comes back to triumph in 1850 or 1851 to Austria and lives another 9 years again, with great insight and with great influence. So even 1848, people say this was the failure of the Metternich system. It survives. It survives 1848.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good way to wrap everything up. He does have to go in exile for a little while, but he does come back to Vienna and passes in, I think, 1851.
1859.
Oh, is it 59? Sorry.
And I should say, and this is something Arthur and I talked about the other day, and let this fact detonate in your brain for a second. You could have been born, I'm sure this is true. You could have been born 59. In Austria when Metternich was foreign minister. Let's say you're born in 1847. You lived to 98 years old. I'm sure some people did. You're a witness to the first atomic explosion, the Trinity test in 44 or 45. So theoretically, you could be a contemporary of Metternich and live to the first nuclear detonation. Now imagine how close that is. We have a picture of Metternich. We have a picture of him. We have a plate photography of him. Daguerreotype photography of him. So these two periods, the guy who beat Napoleon and the nuclear age, people, you ask them and they think, oh, it must be separated by centuries and centuries. You could be a contemporary of both.
Well, let's discuss legacy of Metternich. Because I was thinking of Talleyrand, like Castlereagh. There's some really great diplomats during this time. What, Arthur, do you think is the legacy of Metternich?
I think it's connected to what Louis said just 5 minutes ago. I mean, during the 19th century, there is two kinds of revolution. The people revolution from the bottom, this is the French one, and the conservative revolution from the top, this is the Austrian one. And the model of that revolution will be taken by Bismarck after 1848. Because, all the German Revolution and Austrian Revolution 1848 will not succeed, of course. And so it will try to reform Germany very fast and blah, 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 in order to contain a possible people revolution. So that means I think the legacy is an alternative model to the French model, actually. And it will work quite good to the end of the First World War. So I think because of Metternich, Austria was able to survive 1 century more than she was made to if Napoleon had won the war. That's what I think. I think he gave 1 century more of existence to his country and probably to Germany also, because Bismarck was an intellectual heir of Metternich. That's what I think.
So he gives a century to his country, and I think for all nations and internationally, he shows that balance of power can produce peace.
That's true.
Yeah.
This is something Americans have never understood. Americans tend to be the crusaders of foreign policy. You follow the democratic liberal model, etc. American presidents of the 19th century were so quick to say, European balance of power cost us so many wars. How many millions of dead died because of balance of power? That's not balance of power. It's when a country wants to overturn the balance of power. But balance of power in all its subtlety, the Metternich system, he has shown that it can produce a century of peace. And not anywhere amongst the most historically bellicose nations and powerful nations on earth. And I think in coming into the world we are going into now, where it's no longer American predominance everywhere, but it's now a multipolar world with a Chinese power, an Indian power, which are soon to match economically, socially, culturally, maybe even militarily, the United States. The Metternich legacy is twice as important to study as anybody else, because balance of power is now in modernity once more at the forefront of international affairs. I think more politicians should study Metternich now, perhaps than any other figure of the 19th century.
I think that's a good way to wrap it up. I think to bring it into modern times, the Metternich system, I think that's a good conclusion. So I appreciate that. Louis, Arthur, thank you as always. Again, Louis' book, Napoleon's Library, highly recommend you pre-ordering it, or when this episode comes out, ordering it on Amazon or direct from the publisher. And I think we learned a lot. Merci, Arthur, and merci, Louis, for coming on the show.
Merci, John.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
it was nice.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.